in your introduction, you've probably given my talk for me, which is also very kind of you. So I'm going to cover some of the points that Jim brought to the fore. Next slide, please. So really, this centres on net zero. I'm going to take you on a journey around evidence and what that can deliver for net zero, and how we can evidence the path for that, and what the role of science is in supporting the sort of decisions around that. So primarily, what is net zero? Net zero is the ambition, as legislated originally in 2008, but latterly in 2019, to commit to net zero emissions by 2050, which is essentially a reduction of 100% compared to 1990 levels. This is embedded in legislation in terms of the Climate Change Act, and the Climate Change Act embeds 5-year carbon budgets. We've just published Carbon Budget 6, which I'll return to in a second. That's also the basis, as we're in a COP year, for our NDCs, and our CV6 will be what we're putting forward for a very ambitious nationally determined contribution of 78% reduction by what essentially is the mid-2030s, which will be going forward into the COP process. So we've got to think a little bit about these targets. We've got them, and how we're going to achieve them. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of science and evidence in delivering these sort of targets as embedded in net zero. Next slide. So the next slide shows, next slide should show the 6th carbon budget. There it is, it should show the 6th carbon budget. So as I said, that's just been published, and it's come forward. I think if you look at the 6th carbon budget by the mid-2030s, it shows a number of features that I'm going to expand on a little bit more. It's going to show the need for the expansion of low carbon energy supplies, a take-up of low carbon solutions, a decrease in less carbon intensive activities, and also thinking about the way that we're going to have to transform agriculture. It is ambitious, and it's going to be an important part of achieving net zero. Next slide. But to bring that to life a little bit, I've taken the balanced pathway from the Climate Change Committee's report and just said, well, what are the sort of measures that we're going to have to take as part of that, achieving net zero by 2050? Well, we're going to have to reduce demand. We'll have to go into improve efficiency in the way that we use energy. We're going to need low carbon solutions around electrification, hydrogen, CCUS. On top of the low carbon energy, and think about the way that we use carbon in land, in agriculture, and also greenhouse gas recovery, negative emissions technologies. And actually, I just saw today that UKRI has just published its grants it gave to about 6 consortia on major GGR R&D projects. So they're the elements of achieving it. But if we map that out now into the emissions landscape in the next slide, what does that look like? Well, on the next slide here, we've got all the different sectors that we're now, and the amount that is emitted by that: transport, business, power, land, buildings, and also then again the negative technologies. What I want you to take home from this slide really is, if we're going to take those things, we're going to take this transformation, it's going to require an economy-wide transformation. It's not just, this is going to be something that encompasses everybody. It encompasses the way that we move, the way that business and industry does its business, the way that we decarbonize power, the way that we use natural resources, the way that we change our buildings and the carbon efficiency of our buildings, the way that we emit, and new technologies and new challenges around negative emissions technologies as well. So we take that and we go from, this is what we need to do, and it's an economy-wide transformation, and Jim trailed this. We can begin to think a little bit of this as a systems approach. And the next slide shows just a systems map. You know, a systems map for the energy transition that looks on the left-hand side of the systems map of various technologies, energy sources, gas, electricity, and oil. On the right-hand side of that systems map, it looks at the usage sectors that I had on the last slide: buildings, transport, land, and industry. Then begins to look in the energy transition towards 2050 around some of those ways that systems map will change. And that system itself also sits in a wider system, one which is global. We've got to think of the UK in a global context, and we're challenged this year very much by COP26 you know, in the sense of the global context and challenge of achieving, you know, net zero by 2050, if you want to think of it like that, but of meeting the Paris Accords, really. So that sits in the global energy transition, which also is related to the global economic transition. This is not a problem purely of technology or technocracy. You know, it sits in an economic challenge. I said in the last slide, it's an economy-wide transformation, and that includes things like green finance and all the other things that will stimulate this transition in this system. This system sits in a global system as well as a UK system. And I think what you end up with is a very challenging systems of systems problem. And that's really, you know, what we're going to need to decode in this net zero transition. Next slide, please. What I don't want to leave you with the impression of around the challenge of net zero and the low carbon transition is this is solely a technological problem, you know, that could be solved by mysterious technology that is going to come out of the woodwork. It's also very much intrinsically linked to behavioral change as well. And again, if we go back to the CCC, and it looked at the number of measures that you're going to need to make in order to reach net zero by 2050, over half those measures require some sort of behavioral change as well. And that can be a change in diet, a reduce or change in aviation demand, or think about the way that we use products, choose products that last longer, but choose products that can also be more recyclable. We could design and use engineering in an intelligent way, not that we use engineering in a non-intelligent way, but you know, in order to design products that are more recyclable or use less things to be made for and provide the same function. That behavioral context, I think, is going to be alongside the technology working hand in hand around this. So we've not got to believe that the net zero challenge is solely a technological challenge or a technocratic challenge. It's one that requires economy-wide transformation, society-wide transformation, and technology-wide transformation, working in a systems of systems. Nothing too difficult then, clearly, but you know, you clearly see the scale of the challenge that we're looking at now. Just to bring that kind of back to kind of a reality, let's have a look at it in terms of the energy system. And have the next slide, please. So this is where we are now. This is the Great British electrical demand over the past decade or so. Thank you to the University of Birmingham for this data. If you just click one on, there should be something comes in. Actually, we are reducing, we are showing efficiency. We've had an 18% reduction in efficiency over the last sort of decade or so. You can see some very marked changes there. You can see the marked decline of coal in there. Very little now do we produce some coal, and as Jim said in the introduction, you know, great news from the G7 about the commitment to reduce investment in coal in the future, just announced last Friday as part of the ambition around that. You can see some of the challenges there. You can see the growth of wind and renewables. And that's going to be critical for this. But also you can see the growth of gas. So that offsetting coal as being the growth in gas, which is carbon budget 4 and 5, very much the transition fuel to the mid-30s. But yet we've got to have substantive growth now in renewables and other low carbon generation technologies as part of just the energy transition part of net zero, if you will. So that kind of brings it to life a little bit more. If we go to the next slide, the challenge really, as put on the next slide, is we're going to need to double our electricity generation to meet net zero, and that needs to be decarbonised in order to do that. And you can see that our energy consumption in terms of electricity, which you often think about, but it's also going to be for heating, and also the way that we're potentially going to use electricity or other alternative fuels such as hydrogen in the transport sector as well. And actually we're going to have a very markedly different energy system as well. If one is based on renewables, you're going to have a great deal of what we call intermittency in that system as well. So we're going to have engineering challenges in this new system that we're going to have to bring to light as well. But really, we're going to end up doubling our electricity generation to meet net zero, and we're going to need to decarbonise that and actually deal with that intermittency as we move forward. And that's going to bring to the fore a whole range of new technologies that we're going to need, some of which I've listed on the next slide. to kind of give you a feel of that. We're going to have to bring together carbon capture, utilization and storage. We're going to be thinking about biomass and bioenergy as part of that. I've talked about hydrogen, and I'll just say a few more things about hydrogen in a moment to kind of bring that area to the fore, as well as areas such as greenhouse gas removal and negative emission technologies, whether that be things like direct air capture and the like. So we're going to need a whole bunch of new technologies, and we're going to need to redesign the energy system to meet the demands of decarbonising our economy and that economy-wide transformation. Now, I think at this stage, if there's anybody who's working in the environmental area, they will say instantly to me, yes, but it's not only about mitigation, it's also about adaptation. Absolutely. And in some senses, my challenges around behavioral and the behavioral angles of this is absolutely recognizing that adaptation and mitigation work hand in hand here. There's not an either or, there's only an and between those two areas with respect to the transition in terms of net zero. Just to say a little bit more about hydrogen, because it's a very exciting area, which is on the next slide, that bring to life. We're putting together as part of the hydrogen strategy, and that came out of the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which is on the right-hand side there, which was published late last year in November, which really put down this kind of 10-point plan and goes through some of the industrial and some of the changes that we're going to make in order to achieve net zero by 2050, and that kind of pathway to the things that we're going to need to do. Hydrogen, of which is one of them, the strategy coming out later this year. But we've got to do a 10-point plan. The 10-point plan said we're going to put 5 gigawatts of hydrogen in by 2030. And we've been thinking, okay, if that's the case, what does the R&D roadmap look like for that? How do we pull that apart and think about what science should be doing in this area? We'll go to the next slide. I'll just kind of show you that. And we've put together this sort of roadmap, looking at what we want to do by when, this sort of swim lanes across power generation, industry, transport, building, supply, storage and production. Think about hydrogen and what hydrogen can do, what we're doing in terms of that sort of roadmap, and beginning to put that overall picture together in R&D, and then we can communicate with all the various parties, be they academia, industry and the like, in order to drive that sort of transformation. So I want to take the energy problem, take it down through a single technology, and think a little bit about how we're doing, put that roadmap together to give us a clear view of the demand of that change and that transformation to a decarbonised economy. Next slide. So where do we stand in this? If I take a step back out again, what's the role for science in this? Well, for me, the big change is that science for a long period of time in the climate change and area has been about attribution of change and the rate of change. And now I think, and hopefully you'll get from this talk, that the big push for the future is we're expecting science to step up to give us solutions. It's to give us solutions to this net zero climate resilient future. Drive together the science and technology alongside that behavioral science, in my view, to drive those solutions for change. So in a way, you could say we don't want to know the problems anymore. We want science to step forward, be that social science, physical sciences work together to think around that. And Alex Sharma, who's the COP26 president, as part of the recent Met Office Science Conference, gave a speech saying science is actually going to be vital for tackling that climate change. And it's going to be that science for solutions that is really, really important as part of that. And you can see on the right-hand side kind of a circle of the sort of things that I'm talking about. One further comment on that on the next slide is the Royal Society has come forward as part of the S7, which is the Science 7 that goes alongside the G7, which will be in Cornwall next month, and said, if you're going to do this collaborative science, it's got to be a key role, has got a key role to play in that. We need to develop these evidence-based technology roadmaps, and I've shown you some of our thinking in that, which is continuously informed by scientists, economists, social and behavioural scientists, very much agreeing with what I've given you here, and actually very much what you're doing here in Strathclyde, I think. So really on the nub of this, we need to accelerate the pace of change. We need to do it globally and recognise that we need to support that in low and middle income countries, and we need to put policy packages together and think about what policy changes to encourage economically intensive carbon companies to embrace the neutral options as part of that. So I think a very kind of bold statement that from the Royal Society, working along actually with the Royal Academy of Engineering and others to give that vision around this. Next slide, please. So COP26 is coming up, and as this is a COP26 theme meeting, science is very much part of COP26. It's cross-cutting. It supports both the negotiations and the campaigns. There's 3 flagship science programs supporting the COP26 objectives. One, the visions for net zero, climate risk assessment for the heads of government, trying to make that real, and also thinking about COP26 and health as part of that. And there's really a very strong call to action, very much along the lines I was just talking about, the international science community to provide that science for solutions as part of the COP26 and driving forward and delivering on Paris on a timescale that is viable. So finally, on my next slide, some called key take-home points, I think, hopefully for you. To achieve net zero, mitigate climate change, we're going to require that systems of systems approach, and hopefully I've convinced you of that. Science needs to shift to solutions, and it needs to be that combination of R&D, technology, and behaviour, behavioural science, if you want to call it that. And we need to create sustainable and resilient solutions to net zero, and there's going to be a clear requirement to innovate and collaborate locally, regionally and globally to achieve the outcomes that we all require for a safer future. Thank you very much indeed. And the next slide has my Twitter account if you want to follow me on Twitter, which is a KPI, I believe, for all chief government scientists. Have lots of followers on Twitter, so if you want to follow me, please feel free. Thank you very much for inviting me, and hopefully happy to pick up on some questions if you have any before